Sur la question des trains de ballons mogul, moi,
As for the mogul balloons, I think it's pretty easy to come up with objections to that theory. First of all, it doesn't seem very likely that the commander of a military base with the atom bomb would have mistaken a mogul balloon for a flying saucer and issued a press release stating that we have captured a flying disc.
Nous avons découvert, enfin, que ce soit trompé d'abord.
A mogul balloon train consisted of 20 to 25 balloons attached to a cable. The fact remains that they were balloons. And if I do say so myself, you'd have to be pretty daft to mistake those balloons for a flying saucer. And these men were the Army's best.
Et c'était l'élite de l'armée de l'air, ces gens-là.
Secondly, there is still something strange that has never been properly explained. Having made this error, why would they go and announce it to the press, to the entire world? That seems odd. If it's true that Colonel Blanchard issued the release of his own accord, then he should have been severely disciplined. On the contrary, he led a very successful career achieving the rank of a 4-star general. I have a problem with that. I also have a problem with one of the 2 people who visited the site of the debris. We know that Commander Marcel explained that the debris was extraordinary in nature, but his opinion was disputed. He was accompanied by Captain Sheridan Cavett, who worked with counter-espionage. Cavett was interrogated by the Air Force. There is even a 30-page description of the interrogation in the Air Force's huge report. They tried to convince him to say that he had seen a mogul balloon, but he absolutely refused. He would not admit that this was what he had seen. He stuck to the story that he had seen a weather balloon with its radar target. That's another strange thing that doesn't make sense. Because if he didn't remember for sure, he should have gone along with them and said, yes, you're right, that must have been what I saw, a mogul balloon. The fact that he refused to say it is very interesting. Here we have 2 witnesses who were at the scene, and neither of which admitted to having seen the mogul balloon that they had supposedly discovered.
The
reports about Roswell indicate, I mean, they were basically saying that that what was recovered was not an alien in a flying saucer. I don't think anyone was shocked that the government weren't going to say anything else. If they had concluded that, they were either going to say they were either going to lie or keep very quiet. They said what one would expect them to say. I actually don't, personally, I don't think Roswell was the crash of an alien flying saucer. Indeed, I'm fairly well on record as saying I'm not absolutely sure that's the explanation to UFOs. And I would like to stress I do believe UFOs are a real thing, but it don't have to have that explanation. So I'm not worried about the idea that Roswell was not aliens, etc. And I think the government may well have been telling the truth on that degree. What's important about those reports in 1995, the government released in 1997, also earlier reports, is that they also contained lies, and we know the government lies about UFOs. I think it lies legitimately, one might say, because it doesn't want to give out information about its intelligence gathering sources and so on. That's, I think, fair enough. I think it also lies because it's afraid of what the population can do in panic, and it feels that the population will panic on certain information. And, you know, they quote Orson Welles when he released the story of the Door of the Worlds and everyone panicked in New York and so on, all that sort of thing. And I think that governs a lot of the government's actions. Going back from those reports and Roswell right back to the CIA in 1951, they'd made a very telling comment that they were interested in communication studies of UFOs. And I don't think they meant the communications of flying saucers. I think they meant the way the population deals with these stories and so on. And I think that's been a real governing theme of the governments, particularly American government, over 40 or 50 years, is that they want not exactly to control the population, but to know that the population is not going to get out of control. So I think that report, which came actually without so much pressure, it wasn't actually pressured to come out. I think it was released partly as a way of kind of population, taking the steam off the population and so on.
The validity of that Air Force explanation, in my view, I view it as very weak. It's really only possible to argue the Air Force case, frankly, if you ignore essentially the testimony of everyone who claims to have had any knowledge of Roswell. is a very highly selective document in terms of the evidence that it uses to make its case. And it's surprisingly weak when you look at the actual evidence that the Air Force puts forth. That evidence being that the photograph of the supposed Roswell wreckage that was in the Roswell Daily Messenger, Roswell News of 1947 looks like a mogul balloon might have looked. Of course, that doesn't deal with the accusation of Jesse Marcel that that material wasn't the material he uncovered. The mogul explanation really rests only on that. The rest of the mogul explanation deals with when the balloon launch might have taken place. So that it's a very thin reed to rest such an argument on. My feeling is that the Air Force felt a need to deal with this issue because Roswell by 1995 had become a very significant public relations problem, something that had to be dealt with in some way. And the same thing with the 1997 report.
Although UFO groups accuse the Army of being less than thorough in finding pro-Roswell witnesses, the opposite is also true. In reading the literature that abounds on the subject, it's amazing to see the questionable witness reports that seem to have been accepted as credible by UFO researchers. Let's take Glenn Dennis, for example. In 1947, Dennis was working as an assistant at the Ballard Funeral Home in Roswell. Early in July, he allegedly received a phone call from the military asking whether he had any small body bags, like the ones used to carry children, to which he replied that he did not. Later that afternoon, he supposedly went to the Roswell military base and saw a strange flying machine mounted on a flatbed truck. Then, the next day, Dennis ran into a nurse from the base who said that she had assisted in performing an autopsy of an alien the night before. Everything about this account rings false. If the Army had genuinely found alien bodies, it would never have contacted the assistant of the Roswell Funeral Home to inquire about body bags. It would never have allowed a civilian to enter the base while it was carrying out the most extraordinary recovery operation of all time. And it certainly wouldn't have left a flatbed truck loaded with an alien craft out in the open for all eyes to see. As for the story about the nurse, it seemed to change each time that Dennis told it. She may have died from cancer or a plane accident, or she may have died in her sleep on a military base in England. Despite all the unlikelihoods in his story, all books written about Roswell seem to focus on Glenn Dennis's testimony. And this is just one of dozens of others that are just as questionable. This one only goes to show that it's easier for UFO researchers to find fault with the Army rather than looking in their own backyard. As for the physical proof of the Roswell crash, everything from the film of the alien autopsy to the so-called flying saucer remnants were shown to be a hoax. The Roswell crash has become so well known that people sometimes tend to think that it's the only one of its kind, which is not true. Other similar incidents have occurred since 1947. For example, in his book Behind the Flying Saucers, published in 1950, Frank Scully discusses a rumor of a strange craft and its occupants that crashed near Aztec, New Mexico. We now know that Scully's sources were con artists, but that doesn't seem to matter. The Aztec incident is still part of UFO folklore.
Mixed up with the Roswell crash is also the report of a crash in Aztec, New Mexico, when another saucer is alleged to have come down. Now, there are three real possibilities about that, or at least three obvious possibilities that one could list. One is that it was another saucer that crashed, and if we concede that flying saucers are flying over Mexico, and if they can be damaged in that way, then if there were several on a surveillance, then they could come down in two places. That's possible. The second possibility is that it was in fact the same flying saucer, and that the second piece of debris is actually part of the damage of the first one, which mostly disintegrated over New Mexico, and part of it may have wobbled on and crashed in Aztec. The third possibility, and I think, frankly, it's the strongest one, we know that the Roswell crash was a real crash of something real, whatever it may be. I should say the listening disc is the favoured possibility, an actual disc, huge disc-shaped thing, which in 1947 was used to be carried into the high atmosphere, which could sort of listen round corners in the days before, it was 10 years before we put the first satellite in orbit. So it's possible that it was that kind of dish. But assuming that was the real thing at Roswell, there was certainly a lot of mischief about Aztec with local newspaper reports, particularly local radio stations. Aztec was certainly one of the hoax ones as well. So whether the hoaxes were built on an actual story of a crash, or whether the whole crash story was virtually a hoax, is now, 50 years on, very difficult to determine. And there are proponents of both beliefs, particularly in America, where they've got certain witnesses they have claimed them, but they're usually the sons or daughters of the witnesses who are no longer alive and so on, and certain people are pretty convinced it's a hoax. I think the water is so muddy at Roswell and Aztec that we may actually never really know the truth, frankly.
On December 9th, 1965, a strange object landed in the woods near Kecksburg, a small town 120 miles from Pittsburgh. After the crash, a handful of volunteers, including firemen, went to the woods to investigate. They found a bell-shaped object about the size of a compact car. The Army soon arrived on the scene and told all witnesses to keep quiet about what they had seen. Under the cover of night, the spacecraft was moved to a secret location. Just like Roswell, there's no doubt that something landed in Kecksburg. While a handful of residents swear that it was an alien spacecraft, the Army claims that it was nothing more than a meteorite.
In that case, it wasn't just a matter of hearsay. There were actual eyewitnesses, including firemen. The situation was like Roswell. There were several witnesses who seemed to be reliable, telling this story about the object landing in Kecksburg, and their story seemed to be plausible. Something unusual fell from the sky, was recovered, and then disappeared from sight. It could have been a Soviet space object, or who knows? According to the descriptions given, if it was of Soviet origin, it certainly wasn't a conventional object. The fact remains that apparently something real was recovered.
UFO crashes don't just happen in the United States. On October 4th, 1967, the crew of an Air Canada DC-8 saw a group of bright objects flying near 12,000 feet altitude. Suddenly, two explosions broke up the strange group. One of the objects left the formation and headed off in the direction of Nova Scotia.
With co-author Don Ledger, I've written a book entitled Dark Object. And it's a mass-market paperback that tells the story of a UFO crash that occurred off the coast, southern-western tip of Nova Scotia in 1967. It was the night of October 4th, which was a Wednesday. It was a moonless night. The sky was clear. And what happened was the local residents seen a set of lights that were at least 60 feet in one dimension. They were evenly spaced 15 feet apart. They flashed in sequence. They hovered for at least 5 minutes over the harbor after entering from an easterly direction over the Gulf of Maine. They tilted to a 45-degree angle and descended rapidly to the water's surface, striking it, producing a bright flash and the sound of an explosion. Several local residents called the nearby RCMP detachment. It's interesting to note here that unlike many cases, no one reported a UFO. They simply said that lights or perhaps an aircraft had crashed in the water. Concerns were for survivors. The RCMP dispatched 3 officers and 2 separate vehicles to the scene. And when they got to the shoreline, they saw a pale yellow light moving over the water, and it was at least 8 feet off the surface. They looked at it through field glasses, and eventually it moved around to the point where it left a trail that was 80 feet by half a mile long, and this was dense yellow foam that smelled of sulfur, had a sparkle to it. They grabbed 2 local fishing boats and attempted to reach the impact site, but before they could get to it, the object either submerged or disappeared.
There were bubbles at the surface and a strong sulfur smell in the air where the object hit the water. If it was an aircraft, the rescuers would have to act quickly if they wanted to save the survivors. Rescue boats headed south, but they didn't find any wreckage or survivors.
The Royal Canadian Mounted Police was, of course, by the nature of their work, the people who were first to respond to this. But upon the scene, and when they coordinated with the Rescue Coordination Center and two nearby military bases, Canadian Forces Station Shelburne and CFS Barrington at Backrow, it was clear that it wasn't an aircraft at the scene. Of course, their own observations told them that. They contacted higher headquarters in Ottawa, and it was determined at Defence Headquarters that an extensive underwater search would be carried out, which involved the Coast Guard and naval divers of HMCS Granby. This search continued until Monday. That occurred Wednesday night. At that time, the search was terminated, and they claimed no results. They never denied the belief that a UFO had gone in the water, and they clearly called it that. They simply said that they had found nothing. Now, what is interesting, however, is that local residents and some documentation does keep the door open. Some people claim artifacts were recovered. And the thing is, we do have a document that says quite clearly who would have received those documents. It was a civilian scientific consultant to DND. But again, the official response is nil results.
The incident was forgotten until the early 1990s, when UFO researcher Chris Stiles began searching for official documents written by authorities at the time of the incident. His research soon drew the attention of the producers of Sightings, an American TV series about strange and unexplained phenomena.
In 1995, Paramount Television's syndicated show Sightings funded an underwater search, and what it was I proposed to them doing a 4-day survey, which would include side-scan sonar, a sub-bottom profiler, magnetometer, and divers, to go over the initial impact site of the naval search. The Canadian Navy and the Coast Guard and RCMP divers searched that area for some time. They had a firm belief that something had gone into the water. Checking with the Rescue Coordination Center in Halifax, they knew it was clear that there was no missing aircraft. They didn't suspect a meteorite or natural cause. The thing was, at that time in '67, the search for the craft responsible for the crash was a low-tech affair. It would have been pairs of divers going over the side with flashlights. The water visibility was only 20 feet. With today's technology, it was relatively simple and cheap to look. I thought it was a long shot that we would find any evidence, but one had to look if it could have been lying down there all that time. And so we did. We had our 4-day search with those things. And to be honest, we found absolutely nothing unusual. But I'm not discouraged by that, because that actually tells us something, because in a case where there was so much corroboration and the actions of the military and the documentation, which is an extensive paper trail, says clearly they were certain that this was a UFO and that it was lost there. You have to ask, where did this 60-foot object go? This is shallow water. With this technology, there's not a trace, there's no trauma, no evidence whatsoever. So it's like the one that got away. It remains a great mystery.
Although Shag Harbor remains a mystery, other stories of UFO crashes seem to be hoaxes made up by moneymongers. In the summer of 1989, UFO researchers heard of a crash in the Kalahari Desert in South Africa, near the Botswana border. According to a report supposedly written by the South African Air Force, on May 7, 1989, the military had shot down an unidentified flying object with an experimental laser gun. They then captured 2 humanoid occupants who put up a fight but were eventually taken to an Air Force base in Pretoria. Then, for some odd reason, the humanoids were flown to the United States. Their last known destination was the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio.
One of the crash retrievals around the world that didn't happen in America, which is crash retrieval central for most of the UFO phenomena, happened in South Africa, a crash in the Kalahari Desert there. I've not investigated it personally, but I do have a great deal of faith in a researcher in Africa called Cynthia Hind, unfortunately, who's now died recently, and she investigated it firsthand, and it was her conclusion that it was probably a hoax. Her view was that actually someone was deliberately manufacturing evidence to make a book, sell a story, get a TV series or whatever else. And I can't comment on that because I wasn't there and I haven't seen the evidence firsthand and I haven't personally spoken to anybody. But I have a great deal of respect for Cynthia Hines. She was a very strong proponent of UFOs. She believed they were aliens. She believed that they came from other planets and so on, which is not particularly my belief. And against that background, she was not impressed with that evidence. And I think that to me, gave me a lot of doubts about that case. Beyond that, I don't have any direct information on that one.
One of the suspicious elements raised by Cynthia Hind was the fact that the so-called official report was written in English rather than in Afrikaans, the official language of Pretoria. She also found it odd that the report was full of spelling errors and that it mentioned the title squadron leader, which did not exist in the South African Army. It only existed in the British Royal Air Force. There was also the fact that the document was released to the public by James Van Groenen, a known con artist. Books are filled with stories of UFO crashes, and they all have one thing in common: a lack of physical proof. If alien spaceships have really crashed on our planet, where are they? Could they be stored in a huge crate in a warehouse among thousands of other crates? A possibility inspired by the film Raiders of the Lost Ark. What about the alien bodies found in Roswell? Where are they? With all of these crashes, it's hard to believe that the Army would have been able to recover every single remnant of proof. It's also hard to believe that over the years, no military officer has ever attempted to photograph or film one of these shipwrecked UFOs. Executions, murders, rapes, nuclear testing, and genetic experiments have all been filmed in secret, but no UFO crashes have ever been filmed. There's a saying that a lack of proof doesn't mean that something doesn't exist. After all these years, the proof that UFO crashes happened is so insubstantial that this saying seems to be more of a consolation for believers rather than the truth.
Admitted to having seen the mogul balloon that they had supposedly discovered.
The reports about Roswell indicate, I mean, they were basically saying that that what was recovered was not an alien in a flying saucer. And I don't think anyone was shocked that the government weren't going to say anything else. If they had concluded that, they were either going to say they were either going to lie or keep very quiet. They said what one would expect them to say. I actually don't, personally, I don't think Roswell was the crash of an alien flying saucer. Indeed, I'm fairly well on record as saying I'm not absolutely sure that's the explanation to UFOs, and I would like to
say that he had seen a mogul balloon, but he absolutely refused. He would not admit that this was what he had seen. He stuck to the story that he had seen a weather balloon with its radar target. That's another strange thing that doesn't make sense. Because if he didn't remember for sure, he should have gone along with them and said, yes, you're right, that must have been what I saw, a mogul balloon. The fact that he refused to say it is very interesting. Here we have two witnesses who were at the scene, and neither of which myself. You'd have to be pretty daft to mistake those balloons for a flying saucer. And these men were the Army's best. Secondly, there is still something strange that has never been properly explained. Having made this error, why would they go and announce it to the press, to the entire world? That seems odd. If it's true that Colonel Blanchard issued the release of his own accord, then he should have been severely disciplined. On the contrary, he led a very successful career, achieving the rank of a 4-star general. I have a problem with that. I also have a problem with one of the two people who visited the site of the debris. We know that Commander Marcel explained that the debris was extraordinary in nature, but his opinion was disputed. He was accompanied by Captain Sheridan Cavett, who worked with counter-espionage. Cavett was interrogated by the Air Force. There is even a 30-page description of the interrogation in the Air Force's huge report. They tried to convince... As for the mogul balloons, I think it's pretty easy to come up with objections to that theory. First of all, it doesn't seem very likely that the commander of a military base with the atom bomb would have mistaken a mogul balloon for a flying saucer and issued a press release stating that we have captured a flying disc.
nous avons découvert, enfin, que ce soit trompé d'abord.
A mogul balloon train consisted of 20 to 25 balloons attached to a cable. The fact remains that they were balloons, and if I do say so myself,